Hey, welcome to Accidental Gods, to the podcast where we believe that another world is still possible, and that together we can make it happen. I'm Manda and I spent the first series of this podcast laying out the basic toolkit that we think is essential to the survival of humanity, which is to say, to making conscious evolution a possibility, or even a probability. And now in this second series, we're branching out to find people who are using these tools, people with experience who can act as trailblazers, leading us where we need to go. And today, I'm in conversation with Nathalie Nahai, host of the Hive podcast, which is one of my absolute must-listens this week. In the rest of her life, Nathalie's an international speaker and author of the best-selling book, Webs of Influence, The Psychology of Online Persuasion. Her work explores the intersection between persuasive technology, ethics, and the psychology of online behavior, and she numbers Google amongst her clients. Nathalie and I originally recorded an interview way back in early March, when the world was a different place. It was supposed to be going out in early April, when I was supposed to be teaching in Devon and Ireland. And then the world changed and that conversation kind of passed its sell-by date. It was fun and we might broadcast it sometime, but it didn't feel right for now. Even so, though, we found so much common ground, and we're both very much exploring the potential, the hazards, the strains, the stresses, the transformations of the present moment. And so what we've done is to record a two-way conversation, more than an interview, a dialogue, revolving around these points. This was recorded down the line, and Nathalie's end does have some buzz on it, for which we apologise. Caro has done her sound engineering best to ameliorate it, but it's not perfect. So with that apology in mind, people of the podcast, please welcome Nathalie Nahai. So this is going out on both of our podcasts. We're recording on 17th of April, which is midway through week 4 of lockdown in Britain. How long is it lockdown in Spain for you, Nathalie?
We're just 1 week ahead, I think. So yeah, coming up to the end of week 5.
Week 5.
Yeah.
And do they have a rolling, have you been told you've got another X amount of time, or is it just it's going on till it finishes?
It's fairly ambiguous at the moment. I mean, I think at the moment people are talking about mid-May being when schools may or may not reopen, and that's kind of like a baseline for, or a proxy for everything else opening up. Some shops have gone back to work, but no, everything for the time being is still pretty uncertain in terms of lockdown and when it will end.
And how does it feel for you?
Mixed. It feels, I mean, on the one hand, I have layers of response. On the one hand, I feel like I've settled into this. It does help that it's sunny here most of the time, so I can look out of the window and have that at least. People here are also very supportive of one another. So every evening at 8 o'clock, since the first day of lockdown, people come to their balconies and clap. And on the weekends, on Fridays and Sundays, there's lots of music that's put on by one of our local neighbours, and people join in from the very young to the very old. So it feels connected. But I do think that there is sort of, I was talking about this with some of the guests on the Hive podcast. There does seem to be waves of response internally. So for instance, initially I was very eager to get the Hive podcast new season going, and let's help people and be all, proactive. And in the last 2 weeks I've been thinking, oh God, do I know, where's my motivation dipped and what happens out of this? And so yeah, it's mixed, but yeah, I feel like I'm adjusting to the fluctuations as they come. How is it for you at the moment? How does it feel like for you?
I think very similar. I had this bizarre idea that it was going to feel like downtime, partly because right at the beginning I had this kind of schedule from hell, whereas I was supposed to be teaching at Schumacher for 3 days, then home for a day, then teaching a foundation course for 3 days, then home for 3 days, and then off to Ireland to teach. And I was so not looking forward. I mean, each of the individual bits I would have loved, but the actual crashing of them all together, I was going to be very, very tired by the end of it. And then lockdown happens, like, oh dear, oh,
Yeah.
I have to stay home. And I deliberately didn't take those things off my calendar so that Calendly could not book in mentoring calls or anything over the top of them. And I thought, right, I'm just going to go full Daniel, and Daniel Thorson is my god of the guy who does emerge. I'm just going to do 10 hours of meditation a day for a few days and just really, and no, because we're on a small holding. When I'm here, there's animals to sort, and stuff happens, and I haven't had I think the most I've had is 3 hours one day.
That's good going.
Well, yes, I know, but it's not quite what I had in mind. I had this, and like you, it's the, okay, what can we do? Because I am aware, I live on the borders between England and Wales. We have 13 acres that we manage, and then I live on a hill. I can go and walk for hours and meet nobody, and it's such a privilege. And so I'm very aware that there are people, in the 10th floor of a tower block with 5 kids and 2 bedrooms and an abusive partner,
Oof, yeah.
for whom this must be actual living, if not
Yes.
fatal, hell. And yet, being consumed with guilt isn't necessarily the most constructive of the options that I could bring. And so what can I do with this? And I don't know about you, but I found my emails have increased by orders of magnitude.
Yeah.
and the really interesting Zoom calls and webinars that I could be on. I've done more Zoom calls in the last 3 weeks than the sum total of the rest of my life. And it's not that I wasn't Zooming, it's just that there have been, every evening there's at least one. And most of them are saying this is the biggest opportunity we have ever had to change the trajectory of our civilization. How do we do this? And so I exist in this bubble that goes, okay, guys, we have to make the world different. And then we had a webinar with Accidental Gods last night, and most of the people there were saying they're surrounded by people who are desperate to get back to normal.
Yeah.
And so I realize how much that's the other 99%. And I think it would be a bit of me if I let myself. There's a bit that is in the back of my bus that's just curled up in a fetal position in a corner screaming at the possibility that we might go back to business as usual.
Yes.
Because this feels like such an opportunity. One of the early Zoom calls, Molly Scott Cato was there, was a Green MEP for the Southwest when we had MEPs. The good old days. And she's also an economist. And she said that in her green economic circles, they had likened what we needed to do in terms of taking the fossil fuel-led, extractivist, consumerist economy and changing it to what we needed was like taking a Boeing 747, at full height across the Atlantic and turning it into a helicopter in midair, which is going to fall out of the sky. You can't do that. And she said, but the 747 has landed. It's changed everything. We are, all of the things that people like Extinction Rebellion have been going, this may need to happen, and everybody else was going, well, it just can't, have happened.
Yeah.
The economy has effectively stopped.
But I think the tricky thing is that I have so many mixed feelings about that. I think on the one hand, my overarching feeling is, oh my God, we get this window of time to actually choose something consciously different because everything is on pause. Most things are on pause. Obviously, there are certain things that are in overdrive, like our hospitals and food production and a couple of other industries. But there is so much that is on pause that actually it gives us the time and the space, if we want to lean into it, to do the hard thinking and, okay, how do we rebuild out of this? What do things look like? But I also wonder, it's hard because I think on the other side, there is this sense of, well, is this what it takes for humanity to change course? And of course, if you look at the biggest changes in history, when people who have been a vocal minority have had to stand up for higher ethical values being embodied in civic life, whether that's the suffragettes, whether that's people of Black, Asian minorities standing up for their rights, whatever it might be. Just
ending slavery.
Yes, all of these watershed moments, millions of people have suffered and died in order for these things to come to pass. And so I think on the one hand, like, I don't know, I find the suffering very difficult to countenance. And yet, in the same breath, while all of the suffering is happening, it would be churlish and it would be a shirking of responsibility, I think, to not make the most of the opportunities if we are lucky enough to be in a position where we have those opportunities. But I do definitely worry about, I think it's fine. I can have these conversations with people. I have some savings. I don't have to worry about my mortgage defaulting right now. But if I did, I wouldn't have the bandwidth. I'm not anywhere near being enlightened enough to be able to sit with, the world falling about my ears and think, yeah, I'm going to be fine. So I don't know.
Yeah. Yes. And so exactly, it seems to me that those of us with the privilege have, or I feel I have a duty to at least explore the possibilities of, because a lot of people's lives, it's not as if people's lives have become absolutely untenable as a result of the coronavirus. A lot of people's lives were absolutely untenable anyway. And we were heading for the climate and ecological cliff edge that from which there is no stepping back. The thing about this is probably not a permanent lockdown.
Yes.
It's been severe. It's been the actual definition of acute, which is, that's sudden onset, rather than chronic, which is long term. But the system wasn't working. And I'm really interested. This is a slight rabbit hole, but I'd like to take it anyway. That you said food production is ramping up, because I read an article on Wired this morning, which is one of my go-to sources now for what's actually happening as opposed to what the BBC is telling me is happening. And they're saying that, so in Britain, dairy farmers are basically being paid to not produce.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Because a lot of, where 50% of their production used to go to restaurants and hotels and cafes, and which are not requiring it anymore. And you can't just tell a cow to stop milking.
No.
People are drying off their cows. But once you've dried off your cow, then you have to get it back in calf, and then you have to wait until the calf arrives. You can't just turn it off and turn it on again. And in Britain, we have the self-inflicted chaos of Brexit, and we've just had to fly in plane loads of East European workers to begin to sort out having some food, because strangely enough, all those jobs that they were, quotes, taking, nobody else wanted to do.
Yeah. It holds up a mirror, doesn't it?
Oh, it really does. And I'm really working hard locally. I was already talking about local resilience networks as being, for me, there was a triad of, we need to sequester carbon in the land, we need to massively reverse the destruction of the biosphere that agriculture is creating, and we need local food resilience networks. And so back in November I was going, because when the supermarkets have empty shelves, you're going to wish we'd been planting, and people just look at me like, you're just very weird. And now I don't even have to say the word empty shelves. I'm going, I think food resilience might be a useful thing. And they're going, yeah, that's right. Yes. And because, Africa's having actual plagues of actual locusts at the moment. And India has Modi, and they've not harvested and they're not planting. So that's two major continents look like they're going to have no food by the back end of the year. And that's our total food supply.
It is. I think that the other thing is just it's so overwhelming.
Yeah. So I'm interested that Spain is massively producing food, because I think that's going to be quite crucial.
I wonder about this because, we're in Catalonia where I live, there's a lot of food production that gets exported to other countries. The UK, they do lots of importing for their food. But here I've noticed, and also on social media channels, so many of my friends are now talking about learning how to make bread for the first time, which we also had to do the other day. Planting seeds, instead of chucking out. I've done this with a pepper head. There was a pepper head that sprouted, and so I took the whole head and shoved it in a pot, covered it, and now I've got 2 little seedlings coming up. So things like this, a lot of my friends are having to rediscover on even the tiniest level what it means to be in direct contact with the source of life, the source of food. And I wonder how much, on a macro scale, it's going to be extraordinary to see how things unfold in different countries. And also at the smallest level, how are people re-engaging with, what sustains us? So my brother, for instance, has bought a bunch of fruit trees that he's planted in his back garden. And so I wonder if there's going to be a culture shift But of course, this has to happen swiftly enough for lasting change to happen. So, and for that to happen, I think this lockdown period, however long it is, and the after effects and whatever we build now, also has to be of a long enough duration for new habits to form, for cultural norms to shift and create a new baseline that does form a more solid foundation for expectations of how we want to come out. So I think if we think about things like the universal basic income, which has been bandied around for such a long time, and a lot of people have said, well, you know, in modern democracies, you have to vote for these things, no one's going to vote for it. And of course, now you've got democracies making overnight decisions on how to manage their citizens, including bailing out self-employed people, which took a little while, but it's now happening. So all of these big changes that people said, well, it's not going to happen, it's not possible. In the space of a month, it's happened across the world. Yes,
the magic money tree has sprouted, the one that they said didn't exist.
Yeah.
Yes.
But then it's going to be really hard to roll that back. So when we do have some version of universal basic income and people realize that there are other ways of doing things, well, what else then becomes possible?
Yes. Yes. There was a very interesting thread on Twitter this morning. There's a woman called Dr. Emma Kavanagh, who's a military and police psychologist.
Oh, fascinating.
I've retweeted it. You can find it on my Twitter thread. But she says, okay, so another 3 weeks, let's talk about it, about where we are now. This is a different psychological phase. We've passed through the initial shock of finding ourselves in a global pandemic. We've built some kind of new normal, uncomfortable though it may be. The psychological struggle in this new phase is a different one. And she goes on through that. And part of it is, in this phase, it's common to feel exhausted and burnt out. Remember, your brain is still working very hard to process all this. This is inherently tiring. But there's the understanding now. She says we may feel disillusioned and hopeless, like this will never end, that life will never go back to normal. And I'm seeing that, I think, in the political discourse, such as it is, where they certainly in the UK and obviously the US, the countries where I understand the language, they started off in denial. This is basically flu. We're just going to ignore this and it'll all go away. And then they kind of went into shock of, okay, we better do something. What can we do? And their initial answers to what can we do grew out of their ideology and the emotional and mental constraints of their belief systems of where the world is at. And what I think we're seeing now is a beginning of the grief stage of letting go of all of the imaginings. And that allows space for new stuff to come in. Because, as you say, they're now realizing that they can't just let self-employed people starve. It's not a good look when people that you otherwise have been going, yes, you need to be entrepreneurs, are now destitute. And they definitely don't have it right, but I'm seeing more of an expansiveness of what is possible. And what I would like to believe, I've been reading a lot of meta-modern politics, which is kind of politics beyond tribalism, and hoping that there's enough bandwidth within the ruling classes, enough wisdom with those in power to begin to look at alternatives and not to have the cognitive dissonance of, this stands outside my ideology, therefore I cannot absorb it. Because Universal Basic Income, UBI, I think is a really interesting idea. But my problem with it is, how do you define universal? What do you consider basic? And what do you do about the rents? Rents on the total scale, rents of people who acquire money by not doing any work. Because if we give everybody, at round numbers, £1,000 a month, and the rents go up by £900 a month, we have just discovered the fastest and most efficient way of shoveling public money into private hands that has ever yet been invented. And there are people, I would venture to suggest in my endeavour to not be tribal, there are people for whom that would be a great thing. And we need not to do that. But then how do you control rents in a way that doesn't become totalitarian? And I don't know. So this is one of the reasons why during my kind of economics exploration, I moved from thinking UBI was great to thinking what we needed was universal basic services. Because if everybody has access to housing, food, water, power, broadband, travel, and basics of food, then you can't take those away.
Yeah.
And I think then it's a question of how do you provide those in ways that are equitable and flourishing. And there are models around the world. There's the Mondragon model, there's the Preston model. There's places where this is being looked at, and the whole concept of what money is. We have some solar panels. We put them in after the government had ended all of its feed-in tariffs because they don't like giving you stuff for producing power. But there's a thing called solar coin, where you get something that's effectively Bitcoin for producing power. And I have yet to look into whether you can actually spend this on anything that you might want to spend it on. But imagine if the government decided to insulate every home and put solar panels on every roof and then paid people according to the amount of power that was produced. Money is an idea. This is what I find so fascinating about people, about the magic money tree that they've just discovered. They're realizing that money is, and particularly now, you don't even have to print it. You just type some numbers into a computer and it's there. And the banks have been doing this for several decades now. They've been making money out of nothing and selling it to us at a profit, and then paying themselves bonuses based on how well they did that. And this is a huge scam.
Massive scam.
And now we can look at, okay, so maybe you like to print, make some of this money out of nothing and give it to ordinary people. What would happen?
I do wonder how this whole economy will change, because, you start thinking about how people spend and what we spend on. And of course, I was reading yesterday that Bezos is making absolute killings out of, all the amount that people are buying online through Amazon. But on the flip side, a lot of us are realizing how much we spend on other things. Like, I'm realizing for the first time how much I spend just on food for 2 people for a week, and that now I can spend a bit more on that because I'm not spending on other things. And so there is this sense of understanding maybe where the money goes and what's actually valuable.
Yes.
How many plastic iPhone cases are you going to buy in lockdown? You're really not going to. So things like this, and I wonder whether, and it's something that which concerns me and excites me in almost equal measure. On the one hand, I think, okay, well, it'd be nice if things revert semi to normal with fewer flights in the sky, but I can still get around and do the work that I was doing before. On the other hand, I think, well, what might it look like if money were no longer the driving force?
Yes.
Because actually it may be that we turn the page several steps away that's beyond our ability to imagine right now, but we turn enough pages and we land in a chapter in which money is not the thing that governs exchange of value. And what could that look like? What might there be in its place? And I don't know if we have a model yet for that, but I love the idea of, you talk about local resilience networks. What does it mean if we start to actually provide value in a way that everyone, kind of like an exchange, but if you can provide food and in exchange someone else is providing you with energy, a bartering system that's more direct. Is it possible to go back but also bring it up to date and technologically in an evolved way that means that we're not just regressing? I don't know, what are your thoughts about, are you thinking about potential ways that this could look? Because I know it's at the moment, it's very imaginal.
Yes. I think 2 steps. So the first and the most important of these is we can't know how it looks until we know how it feels. So what I am really doing with my meditations at the moment is, and I recorded a meditation and put it out on the resources page for absolute free distribution to anyone who wants it, is to really work on, if we got everything right from this moment forward, without defining what right looks like, how would it feel? How would my heart space feel? How would my body feel? And what I'm finding is an extraordinary sense of release and relief, of tensions that I didn't know I was holding, a sense of safety, a sense of courage of being able to just be me. And finding my authentic self, which sounds like one of these things that, there's memes flipping around on Facebook. But what does that actually feel like? And it's so liberating. And so I'm really quite hard trying to bring together a group of film, television people, directors, producers, writers, and if anybody listening wants to join, let me know. Because I think we could get lost down the how could this be done economically, and I'm on a Zoom call later tonight with the New Economics Foundation exactly looking at this. But We need to know how it feels. And then I think we need a sense of a narrative of how that feeling could play out. And we haven't. For all of our recent evolutionary history, we have narratives of disaster. We know how Mad Max feels. We know how 28 Days Later feels. We know how Handmaid's Tale feels.
Yes.
And what they look like. I am not aware of anything as big as those, or indeed anything, that really looks at how could it be if we got it right. And 10 years ago when I said that to people, I was met with, oh, yeah, but that would be kind of utopian, don't you think? We don't know. Nobody wants to... I still think that Monsanto will dig its heels in and endeavour to do everything that it possibly can just to make huge amounts of money by destroying the entire ecosphere. So I don't think it'll be utopian. But I think if we don't really pour extraordinary amounts of our focus and bandwidth into feeling our way forward and then creating a creative narrative of how that feeling plays out, then we can begin to build the economic models that get us there. Otherwise, we're just, I think, iterating more of what we already have. I think Kate Raworth is one of my absolute heroes. She wrote Donut Economics, which is one of those economic books that everybody should read. And her premise is that at present we have a system where the economy must grow, whether people and the planet flourish or not. And what we need to get to is a system where people and the planet flourish, whether or not the economy grows. So that as a premise is, and I in my naivety thought that this was a basic fundamental tenet of human life. And then I said it to our local Conservative MP as a basis for a potential evening event. And he said, but we said no politics. I'm going, but why is it people and the planet flourishing? Is that political? And he said, yes.
That's extraordinary that we've gotten to that stage. That's even a question.
Yeah, because the idea that growth is not the primary thing was, this was last November though, and I'm kind of planning the email to him now going, that conversation we're going to have, could we find a way to depoliticize it? Because I think it's really essential. But I do think we need to get to the feeling first. How does that sit with you as an idea?
Yeah, I really like it. I think also, especially when you look at the ways in which we make our decisions, the primary motivation is usually an emotional one. So if we have a sense of what that feels like first, then it becomes much easier for us to recognize options and opportunities, however small they might be, that align with that feeling.
Yes.
And I think also the other thing is when you think about the ways in which we create, so everything that sits around me in the room or with you or with the person listening, that's come out of someone's imagination, right? So there has to be a starting point, a creative point. And I think it's much easier to create when you have a longing to do so, which generally doesn't come out of fear, although I know that great innovation also comes out of need. Yeah. But I think if we compare need with this forward driving, this desire towards something, then maybe that's the most empowering and creative way to approach the problem. I really like the idea of that. Yeah.
Oh, you just seem to, you have a very strong creative network where you are, given the podcast that you've been doing. And I'm thinking that if we could bring together a creative network where we're kind of co-creating that, or each of us exploring that feeling and then sharing it, something quite amazing could arise out of that.
I agree. I think especially one of the things, we talk about having a narrative that gives us a window into what a different world could be like. I think there's different ways that we are able to access that. So for instance, I remember when I was very young reading this book by Starhawk called The Fifth Sacred Thing. And she very recently produced this thick doorstep of a book called The City of Refuge, which fast forwards into the future. And it's exactly about this. It's when life has broken down, everything's under a surveillance state. What do you do? How do you rebuild? And it touches on a lot of these themes. So I find it really interesting to hear stories played out in that way. Or for instance, one of my beloved shows, Star Trek, which I grew up with, and talking about what might it look like to have different factions collaborate for a common goal. Or music, for instance. I find that beyond, for me at least, beyond the visual arts, if you can sing a piece of music that names what's happening in the situation in which we all find ourselves, and takes you through the stages of denial and grief and loss, and takes you to a point where it can emerge you into a different space. It can create that sense of hope and of the sun rising again after a difficult night, even if it rises on a totally different landscape. I think that kind of journey through something emotionally can be extremely powerful and can give people enough space to have enough hope to envision something different.
Yeah, and music and song go in at such a deep limbic level. It's another way of bypassing our whole yes but senses. I was talking to Rob Hopkins, whose book is called From What Is to What If, and he plays a game with. He's done it with quite big companies, and then also with just local resilience groups, where somebody puts out an idea, and you're allowed to say. So they go, "What if people on the planet were able to flourish?" And you're allowed to answer with another "what if." So yes, and what if everything were pink? I don't know, or a yes and. But you're not allowed to say yes, but. You're not allowed to say anything except another what if or a yes, and it just opens people up.
It's like improv classes.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally is. But focused on, what if there were no cars in the street?
Yeah.
He's done this with little local networks. Yeah, what if? Yes, and we could hold parties every other day. Not in lockdown, but yes. And I just think those sorts of things, if we're back to you and I and people like us have the enormous privilege of this time being not only bearable, but probably quite fertile. And if we can use that fertility to create the space for something different to emerge, I think it would be a wonderful thing.
So I'm wondering, if we think on that for a bit, one of the things that I really admire and also wish I could have more of that you do is you engage very heartily in these practices. So you enact your values, and you're very actively involved in creating dialogue and space and activity for people to engage more deeply themselves with the things that you're talking about. And as I listen to you and I listen to the Accidental Gods podcast and I go through the fantastic resources on your platform,
Thank you.
I find myself, on the one hand, aspiring to do more of that. And on the other hand, my lived reality is, fuck, my program for my podcast has crashed again. That's another 4 hours down the chute and I'm supposed to be getting enlightened. And how am I supposed to do this from my tiny flat? And it's just, and on the one hand, it's actually very, very funny. But on the other, I'm just thinking, this isn't the best use of my time. And how do you, which in itself is all noise as well, how do you pass all of that? And for people who are listening who think, actually, I'm also frazzled and I'm split in all these directions. And this lockdown was supposed to give some free time back.
Yeah, and it really hasn't.
And it really hasn't. How, what would you suggest? Like, how do you find ways to help people manage with this?
Yes, and it is. And I am totally aware that I have massive privilege because I always worked from home. So up to a point, my self-organising, it was already there. But I did get an email this morning from one of my wonderful, wonderful dreaming students who's also an Accidental God student who's got one child aged 5 and one aged 2. And they're all at home. And how do you even manage to have time to pee, never mind anything else? And so I think one of the things that is really working for me and that I'm trying to pass on is that it doesn't take any extra time to be fully present in every moment. But it is a skill. And it's a learned skill that only comes with practice. And so even if you can only commit to being fully present every time you wash your hands, which we're all doing quite a lot at the moment, that's a start. There is an extraordinary luxury to be able to sit down and actually meditate for a full hour. And it definitely, we know neurologically, neurophysiologically, that changes neuronal structures. But the HeartMath people have also done work on, if you do 3 minutes of their heart coherence work in any form, which is essentially slow your breathing down, slow your breathing down, bring your attention to your heart space, breathe directly into your heart space, and intentionally feel a positive affect. And their key ones are gratitude, care, compassion, appreciation. But anything, you feel hope, if you can feel something that you can evoke in your heart space, 3 minutes of that will produce measurable physiological change. And then the next time it will be easier, because it's not as if that's actually an easy thing to do. It took me years to be able to actually evoke a sense of gratitude that felt real and wasn't just an idea. But once it happens for a little split second, then the next split second is a little bit longer. So I think we have created for ourselves lives of extraordinary distraction.
Yes.
And yes, something crashes and it's like, oh God, that's half my day gone trying to fix a bit of technology. Why did it not work in the first place? Or the dog gets sick, whatever. I think learning to slow down would be one of the great lessons of this. I haven't found it yet, but I'm still hoping. But being fully present. I can be fully present while I'm cooking. Faith will laugh if she hears this because I very rarely cook. But I can be fully present doing the washing up. I can be fully present walking the dog. I can be fully present talking to you now. And it feels different to the kind of slight fuzz where my attention is in 4 different places and one of them is in the past and one of them is in the future.
Yeah.
And one of them is looking at my little dopamine. I've been really looking a lot recently at the difference between dopamine and serotonin pathways. Because a lot of the online stuff is triggering dopamine. And it is inherently, it's linear pathways that wear out effectively. The more dopamine we have, the more we need to get the same effect. And eventually they just stop. Those neurons just give up. And they give us a short-lived hit of what the guy I'm reading is Robert Lustig calls pleasure. Serotonin is big branching pathways throughout our brains, not just these little linear ones, that don't wear out. They don't downregulate. And we don't keep trying to seek to get more stuff to feed them. They're more what he calls happiness, contentment. And so I'm really looking at how can we create more contentment and thereby need less pleasure, because the dopamine pathways are addictive. And I think for me, a lot of the kind of spray of grasping at Facebook or Twitter or whatever is feeding those little dopamine pathways.
Yes.
And it takes my attention. I can feel it as a drag. If I can feed more of the serotonin pathways, feed more of the contentment, which can last a lifetime. The thing about the dopamine is it's short and then you need another hit. Whereas if people have experienced that moment of total connectivity, the memory of that lasts forever, and the ability to reach back for that and rekindle it is there for the rest of our lives, whatever else we're doing. And I'm thinking that if we can do more of that collectively, and that also feeds into that felt sense of, if I do my meditations of how does it feel like if we get it right, my heart space is in that place and doesn't have hanging around it the yes buts that if I try and evoke gratitude, I can evoke gratitude, but I'm also now aware that hovering around the outside of that, like an envelope, is the fear waiting to come back in. The fear of loss, the fear of lack, the fear of not feeling the world is abundant, the fear of becoming a bag lady, the fear of, I don't know, the Tories winning power forever and turning us into, the 10,000-year Reich of Steve Bannon's greatest dreams. All of those are kind of sitting there. I have created those. But what happens if I let them all go? How do I feel if none of those obtains and we get it right? And the sense of all of those boundaries falling away has been huge and really generative. I feel like a different person. And in a good way. I'm very happy with the different person that arises out of this. So I think for me that's a big one in terms of what are we doing with this time, is being fully present and then being able to evoke that contentment. Does that answer the question that you asked?
Yeah. And also it strikes me as you were giving this image, for everyone listening, you can't see the way that Manda was using her hands to describe the serotonin networks being something kind of like an encompassing ecosystem or web around the brain. But what struck me as I saw you doing that physically was that this is precisely the kind of ecosystem, collaborative system that we need to create, that I would suggest that we need to create physically in in whatever form you can, whether locally or globally, in order to create something new coming out of this. So this idea of infinite linear growth and burning through pathways of dopaminergic, kind of like a dopamine driven, consuming, always better, bigger, faster, stronger projection towards a devouring economy, that it's a hunger that can never be filled. And it seems to me that maps on, maybe it's just sort of my imaginative brain wanting to link these concepts, but it maps onto this never satiable hunger for that next hit. And of course, when you strip all of that away and you think, what if I hold in my mind the times in my life when I have felt most whole? And for me, it's in the company of either a beautiful landscape or a beloved other or friends. And very little of it ever has anything to do with a bigger house, a bigger car, fancy shoes, whatever it is. And so I wonder, when we're thinking about this dopaminergic versus serotonin kind of mapping of pleasure or contentment or hedonism versus eudaimonia, when we think about these as dance partners, where do we want to spend more of our time, and how do we use that to then design systems that are more aligned with one or the other? Because at the moment, I think we're in the fast hits, rapid growth, devouring without being satiated dopamine side of things.
Totally. Yeah. So the question then arises of how do we create these networks? What we can call the serotonin networks, the contentment networks. How do we create them within ourselves, and then how do we create them on a wider scale? I don't know the answer to that. Up to a point, that's what Accidental Gods, I think, is existing to try and do. But there have to be other ways also. But I think if we can do that, and if we can then harness that to the felt sense visioning of how could the world be different, then it could actually be different, which leaves, fills me with great hope when otherwise I can look at the world and find great despair. I watch Trump doing whatever he's doing, and my entire being falls off a cliff. I think this is just, there is actual craziness in the world. Why? But I don't. And so then I come to one of the concepts that's been quite alive in my world for quite a while, is that concept of critical mass of people. And what is the critical mass? Because Extinction Rebellion had this idea of 3.5%, but that was based on, as you said, the suffragettes, or ending slavery, or ending apartheid, or getting to gay marriage in various parts of the world. But each of these was increasing the franchise of the existing system. They weren't changing the entire system. So I'm not sure that 3.5% works. And then I've been reading Hansi Freinacht, I've just got to the point where it's just annoyed me too much and I've had to stop. But a lot of his ideas are good. It's just the deeply patronising tone that isn't. But he's looking at layers of society, and it seems that at what he calls the meta-modern level, which is the level that we're talking about now, the kind of beyond postmodern, that it's 1% of the entire global population that at the moment is within this, or has the capacity to work at this level. And so I'm hitting internal, do we need a specific number as a tipping point, in which case 1% of 7 billion is quite a lot of people? Or do we need a percentage of the population, in which case I think we're probably not going to get it. And so then the next question is, if there are the different layers of framing of how the world is, how do we help people to rise up? Is there even, or is it just too patronizing to suggest that if you're locked in a fear-based, hyper-nationalist, let's say white supremacist worldview, that you are locked into because you are genuinely afraid that anybody who doesn't fit that model is going to destroy your way of life? Can we shift people from that to something more generative and communitarian? And do we have the right even to try? And I don't know the answer to that. These are things that I'm staring at quite hard and trying to, whether that's just me exerting some kind of bizarre kind of meta-modern white privilege, or whether by creating the networks and by helping people to find community and connectivity and that sense of contributing to a greater whole that is is so obvious at the moment. Does that break down what are essentially sociological structures that people have created just to define people? And does it allow more fluidity? And does it allow people to shift into new ways of being?
Yeah, that's super interesting. One of the things that sort of really jumps out for me, this idea of, do we have the right to try to create a different system? And I think one of the things that I find helpful sometimes is flipping the framing on its head and saying, okay, well, what do the other side, if we're going to talk, I know there's sort of this sense of tribalism, but what is the other position that sits at the polar opposite end?
Okay.
What do they think? What's their position? What's their assumption? And I think that if we're taking it from the perspective of, let's just say, a fear-based response, if things change, I'm going to be annihilated. That's kind of, we can all share that at some level, this sense of, we've had this fear at some point in our lives, or at some rudimentary level we can access that. So if you think, okay, well, a person who's in that state is likely to want to fight more often than not to preserve their life, to preserve the lives of the people they love. And so it's an understandable thing. And then you think, okay, well, I'll sort of slice this in one way. If we think about ways in which, so from a tech angle, the current pandemic can provide fertile ground for expanding the surveillance state. The people who want that, who have a lot to gain from data gathering and setting up legislation in a time of emergency, they are absolutely going to not question whether they have a right. They're going to make it their absolute imperative to be able to get as fast and as deep as quickly as possible. So I think if we're thinking about it in terms of rights, taking it back again to this position of, what right do I have to want to create or build towards a system in which we don't have to fear for our lives as much, in which we can reduce overall suffering, in which we can encourage and help one another to thrive. And when I say one another, I mean the entire interconnected web of life.
Yeah.
I think we absolutely have the right to envision ways in which that might be possible. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, we're all going to die. We're living here with a certain amount of time. How do we want to spend that time? Basically, it comes down to that. And I know I'm saying it sort of slightly flippantly, but there is a lot to that. And do you want to be at the point of our deathbed thinking, well, I just didn't think I had the right to try and make the world a better place.
Okay.
And we all have different visions of what that means. But like, I think if it can be, and this is where my sort of liberal values come in, but if we can be of a mindset, or maybe it's an old traditional Buddhist value, of reducing as much suffering as possible, I would definitely stick my flag in that.
Okay.
And say, yep, I'm with it. Let's do it.
Brilliant.
If we fail, we fail, but what option do we have? Come on.
Yeah, no, you're right. Absolutely. Yes.
I sort of just took one aspect of what you said there and ran with it. But I feel quite strongly about that, apparently.
Yeah, it's good. Very good. Right. So then we're back to, okay, if we have the right.
How?
And in fact, we possibly have the imperative. Yes, how do we do that? Yeah, so maybe we'll just go away and think about that for a month and then do another podcast on what we've come up with. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, there was an interview that I heard once between this chap. I'm going to try and see if I remember this correctly. It was an Orthodox Jew and a white supremacist at university, and they ended up having dinners together.
Yes, I remember. It
was this extraordinary interview, and I think what really struck me about this, because I have been on the tail end of being, I've experienced terror, put it that way, in certain situations, one or two in particular, and I know that if you're in a state of fear dipping towards terror, the only thing really that gets you out of it, I think, is understanding that the other person knows where you are.
Yeah.
And at least if you can feel that the other person has hit some kind of rock bottom that you're experiencing, you may have enough openness within you to be able to build something and get yourselves out. And so I think when we are experiencing abject fear and we're in a position where we're trying to defend against new or different or change, maybe the first thing is to say, all right, we get that you're in abject fear. I've experienced this too. What is it that you care most about? And then orient the conversation about that. What are other ways to protect what you care about, to build on what you care about? Like, I don't know. I think, again, maybe it comes down to this sort of deep, compassionate reframing.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Gosh, I was heading down polyvagal rabbit holes as you were speaking, and but that's a different podcast possibly, um, and also one of the great models that I really enjoyed that we came across at Schumacher was Tom Crompton's Common Cause Foundation, and it's a very visual thing. I need to probably try and find it and we'll put it in the show notes, because he's looked at something he calls intrinsic and extrinsic framing, and that we all have the capacity to be encouraged by both intrinsic senses of self-worth and extrinsic values judged by other people. And that the more that you speak to somebody's intrinsic values, so if we share community, cooperation, commitment, all of those things that allow us to feel more heart open, as we talk to people about that, their senses of those also increase. And at the same time, it's on a seesaw. As one goes up, the other goes down. So the more that I think about community and how can I contribute to this, the less I'm worried by whether someone's impressed by the size of my car.
Yes.
And the more I sit around talking to people whose value structure is, are you wearing the right watch? Do you have the right car? Do you take the right holidays? The more those increase within my sense of worth and my intrinsic senses dip. So it gives us a way to connect to people that is part of our shared common heritage. And I think that's one of the things that I'm finding really quite inspiring about some of the responses. I don't know if you've heard in Britain, there's some 99-year-old war veteran who committed to walking around his garden, and he's raising millions of pounds for the NHS. Yeah. And the part of me is like, oh, go that guy, that's totally amazing. And another part is, we shouldn't need 99-year-old guys on their Zimmer frame to be raising money for the NHS, guys. But it's definitely, it triggers empathy in people, and it triggers a sense of community and that wanting to contribute. And so the more that we can do that, the more we can bring people together, the more, I think, one of the things that has really struck me in the last couple of months is we have to get rid of the tribalism. Tribalism puts us into non-conducive frames of mind, and it erects cognitive dissonance barriers. That if I am deeply invested in my own tribal position, and I speak as a very newly ex-Labour activist, I left the day Keir Starmer was elected, then I cannot. It's physiologically impossible for me to take on board things that I label at an amygdaloid level to be of the other tribe. And that happens at so much faster a pace than my frontal cortex can cope with, that the decision is made and there is no logical arguing past it. So we have got to get people out of the tribalism in order to be able to create the kind of world that we need, that is beyond tribal structures. So I'm looking at how can we move beyond tribalism without that sounding like a tribal position. And I think the only way to do that is to really speak to people's intrinsic value systems. And finding the language that works.
I think the other thing that's really interesting, that's kind of the paradox within what we're saying, is naming how things are without falling into the trap of seeing things only in that way. So, for instance, something that I find really interesting that connects for me with that is the naming of the visible and less visible key workers who are keeping everything going, the people who are previously overlooked. And on the one hand, it requires a naming of reality as it has stood and as it stands now, but it also invites us to value those people differently, and hopefully valuing one another differently will then translate into the way in which we perceive people when we come out of this. And I think that's the thing that I'm most attentive to, I want to say, kind of cautious about and also hopeful for, that the changes that we are seeing now, the appreciation that's shifted, the visibility of the work that people do, the valuing of that work, that's something that hopefully will continue long enough for, again, this shared humanity to be the thing that we focus on, so that when we come out, it will be less about labels and will be more about people showing up as they are, without all of this extra labeling. And I know that we, with a background in psychology, I know that we label for a reason. We like to simplify. We like to make things easier for us to understand and to pass, if you like. But couldn't we use a different way of doing that? So I think, this thing of what is it that we value as a society, and the fact that we're not going to get out of this through individual action. We can't get out of this individually. It has to be a collaborative effort. Either we sink together or we swim together, and that is becoming ever more apparent to me. Fierce individualist as sometimes I think I might be, and it's really making me realize, one, the vulnerability of the individual, but two, the power of the collective, and each lending our own individual skills and abilities to help one another. Beyond politics, beyond all of that.
Yes. And I'm aware that time is running on. I think this is so interesting, but I also think we kind of almost have looped back to where we started, which we've done spirals around the same point, which is that we are individuals. Each of us can only ever change ourselves. But if in doing the changing of ourselves, we can then change the collective dream of humanity, then I think the future is unknowable, but also totally amazingly gorgeous. And that is worth working for. I'm sure there's other things that we could talk about. You had a very good question that you were asking people that I can't remember what it is now.
Final one is, what question do you want people to dwell with at this moment?
So if I were to answer that, my answer is, how would it feel if we got it right from this moment? Really, how would it feel in my heart space? Don't think about it. This is not a thought game. This is a sit down and imagine if the world were absolutely as good as it could possibly be. How does it feel? How do I feel? I think if everybody did that for 5 minutes a day, the world would be a different place. So what would your question be?
I think my question would be, I'm thinking about this in terms of a visual exercise, like if you imagine yourself at the end of a long and rich life and you're peacefully on your deathbed and you think back, you think, yeah, I lived the fullest life I could have done. What would that person suggest to you right now in how you can live your life differently in this moment?
Okay, and then tell us, people. We have 2 podcasts. We have The Hive, we have Accidental Gods, and this is going to go out on both of them. So you can answer either of us. Tell us. It would be really interesting if our joint listenership,
both of us,
peoples of our podcasts, actually did this. And then fed back. We could begin to make this network actually work. That would be quite something. Alrighty, I think we might be done. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
So that's it for this episode. Enormous thanks to Nathalie for the clarity and humanity of her thinking. It is such a pleasure to talk with someone of such depth. We'll be back next week, as ever. But this week, I want to do something a little different. Because I really meant it when I said that the most important question we could ask ourselves now is, what if we got it right? How would that feel? We genuinely can't get anywhere unless we have a bodily felt sense of how it might feel like when we arrive. We all want to fall in love because we project a lot of how it might feel like onto that moment. We want a job or we move to a new country because we project forward how we think we're going to feel when we get there. A sense of joy or pride or achievement. Or, in my case, when I really let myself feel forward to how it would be if we collectively got it right, there's a sense of a kind of liberation that I didn't know was possible. A sense of connectedness to the web of life that I've seen in visions or imagined, but never actually felt as a bodily felt sense until recently when I started doing these meditations. So what I want to do now is to invite you to feel that too, or your version of that. You could sit and do it now. Sit in a quiet place. Relax. Feel yourself into your physical body. Feel your margins. Breathe into your heart space as if each breath were going in to your thorax. And slowly, very slowly, ask yourself the question, how would I feel if the whole of humanity got everything right? I don't need to know how we get there. I don't need to know what it looks like. I need to imagine how I would feel if everything were flourishing, if I were to fully flourish, if I were to be everything I could be, if the world were to be perfect. How would I feel? Let whatever comes be what it is. Explore it. Hold it in your attention lightly. And really let the feeling fill the whole of your body. How would I feel if people and the planet could flourish from this moment forward? Let each breath in draw the feeling bigger so that it fills you more. And as you breathe out, connect to whatever lives around you, to the earth, to the sun, to the sky, to the trees, the rocks, the birds, the rivers, the rain, the people, the plants. Whatever is part of the web of life around you, send the feeling out with your out-breath. And when you're done, come back slowly to the sense of here and now without necessarily letting the feeling go. So that is one option. But it works best, I think, if you can give it more time. So what we're going to do for the first time is release as a podcast a meditation that will do this for you, taking you deeper for longer into that question. Again, find somewhere quiet to do it. It'll follow up on this podcast. You don't have to do it now, but it'll be there to do between now and the next podcast next week. Do it as often as you can. Do it as often as feels good to you. Because the more of us do this, the more of us can build that felt sense so that it lasts, something that we can come back to in the default moments through the day, the more chance we have of building a world where this feeling obtains for a long time on a regular basis. Where we put our attention is where we need to send our energy. And we can do this if we have a template of the feeling when we get there. So give it a go. If you want even longer versions of this, they're on the website, which is accidentalgods.life. Head to the Pandemics Resources page, and by the time you get this, we may also have set up a What If blogs page, and they'll be there too. The show notes are on the website along with this, other blogs, and the membership program in case you want a more structured way to reach for conscious evolution and the absolute transformation of what it means to be human. And so this is the time to thank Faith for building the website. She's also set up an Instagram account, so if you want to make her day, go over to Instagram and give her a like, accidental_gods. Thank you to Caro C, as ever, for the music at the head and foot of the podcast and for the sound production. And thanks to you for listening. We absolutely wouldn't be here without you. As ever, if you've enjoyed what you've heard, please do subscribe. It helps us to know that you're there. 5 stars and a review helps Google to take us seriously. But as always, if we're going to change the world, it'll be by word of mouth. So send the link to anyone you know who wants to live a new world into being. And that really is it for this episode. See you next week. Thank you, and goodbye.